So let's.
We probably should go to the panel.
Yeah. Sorry. Let's save all that energy and thank you for this powerful talk, Luis. So I know that there are people with questions, but let's save that energy for the panel. I'm gonna and the panel chair is gonna be Stephen. So you're gonna see a different face.
Okay, and I'm here, and I guess we can just go right into the panel discussion. And I mean, it's been several great talks today, and I think we're all a little fired up now by Luis's recent discussion. But I think it is important to open it up a little bit, just to make sure we maybe we can even inject some optimism into the conversation. But I guess I think one thing that's come clear from the discussions today is that the kind of the science, bureaucracy, public world is very complex, and there's sort of multiple different tiers of kind of interfacing, right? So the enterprise is individuals, it's local communities, it's governments, it's the world, and I guess it's one thing which, and I think you've all touched on it a little bit, but especially for students here in the class, what I guess what are sort of practical things that we can do kind of at these different levels, right? And I guess I want to kind of make sure we get back to some of the earlier questions just about communication with the public, and kind of maintaining integrity. So I don't know if anyone would want to kind of chime in there, and maybe I could either give Jevin or Manya a chance to kind of get started.
Well, first of all, I always get fired up when I hear Luis talk. So I just if he can't fire you up, then you need some more coffee or whatever. But I also do, and just one quick comment too about the shiny objects thing. I think we see this in the quantitative world too. We see everyone jumping to the neatest, greatest quantitative analyses that has to be done for a paper to be published. I think that's problematic all by itself. But there's lots of things I'd like to follow up on both Manya's and also Luis's, but I'll just sort of go directly to yours, Stephen, about some practical things that we can do. I mean, I think this organization, self-organizing, I think is a great thing. I hate to say this because I'm not a huge fan of the way that Twitter has changed collective conversation, both in science and society. But I think, that there's this platform that people can use to push out examples of things that they see of bad behavior. And that can be, risky for those early in their career. But I think if you're careful in the way that you annotate your examples and you show how, show the ways in which you can make improvements to the overall system, I think that can be helpful. I mean, I can give you some examples. So if you can point to ways like, I point to examples, and I have a class that's called Calling Bullshit with my colleague Carl, that I mentioned before. And when we provide examples, a lot of times we point to what's called Hanlon's razor. And this is don't attribute malice to what could be simple incompetence. And even better than that, instead of incompetence, that could be honest mistake. And I think in a lot of cases, when we look at mistakes in science, even to the great scientists that we read about, the Luis that was talking about, they made so many mistakes along the way. And they said, even looking, I'll give you an example. One of the originators of the field of statistics used to think that, I won't even put his name because you should know who he is, and I don't want to, well, actually, I should name names because Luis was naming names. Used to think that smoking, we think, we know that smoking sort of causes cancer now after years of it. You shouldn't have taken decades of research to show that. But there are reasons why that took so long, that were societal forces and industry forces. But he claimed at the time that cancer caused smoking. And you would think that the person that sort of invented all of statistics would not have made that claim, but he made that claim, and pretty strongly. And there's, lots of historians that have talked about why he was making that claim. But I think, people have do make mistakes in their logic and their thinking. And I think if we are at least a little bit empathetic, but still go after and name names, I think it's important to do that. I mean, and this example too, just because I'm sort of fired up by Luis's examples too, but this example of 300 papers published per year, by my word, I mean, what's wrong with our system of communication? There's no way anyone could explain each one of those articles. So are they being required to be on there because they were funding? I'm not a huge advocate of that. And actually there was some great biologists, Lewinton used to talk about how this was an egregious use of name attribution when you're putting yourself on a paper just because you funded the lab or something. If you're part of the conversation, fine. So maybe we make rules that say you have to be able to at least explain your paper at a conference. If you can't explain the details, maybe you shouldn't be on that. Yes, and actually Fisher, I forgot to say the name. Thanks for putting poor old Fisher gets attacked. But I mean, come on. This was something we call out. So anyway, I think in terms of practical things, Stephen, I think we should be calling things out with examples, but also with some empathy on that. But also, we have opportunities in this field to be talking to policymakers. We're closer to the policymakers in this field than most fields have access to. I think we need to be bending their ear as much as possible. So anyway, I'll let others on the panel speak to this, but I think there are practical things that we can do, and I encourage everyone to do that, because science needs it. We just like the Roman Empire, at some point it could falter, and I think the science institution can if we let it keep going in some of these directions.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing that I've found really inspiring is there's a network of early career researchers called Reproducibility. I just put it in the chat, and that's it started in the UK, so it was about getting together for tea and talk, and it was basically a lot of junior lab members who felt that their PIs were not letting them do science as rigorously as they themselves wanted to do it, because their PIs wanted papers. And this has sort of nucleated other efforts, and it's given a way to bring ideas to the table. And this article that I put up is actually old. They've done a lot more since then. I also think a lot of someone referred to Henlon's razor. I mean, I think a lot of times people just don't know what they need to do. So there's I think the carpentries, like the data carpentry, where they recruit young active scientists, and they're really changing the culture using mechanisms and levers that, as far as I can tell, I'd love to know what people who are, this is my outsider perspective, these kinds of things are allowing the culture to change much more swiftly than one funeral at a time, and they're very open to volunteers. There's also the contributorship model, which is a little more flexible than just provides more information than authorship, because there's so many different things that go into producing a paper. I hear my sentences quoted all over the place. I don't actually care that nobody names me, but there's so many things that go into producing a paper that the idea of one category of authorship doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, authorship is a really important issue that it is also very science specific, right? I mean, one of the things, for instance, for me reading articles in economics was that, it's sort of the RA that did all the data collection, or maybe even coded the analysis and stuff like that, is tanked in the acknowledgements instead of being a co-author, right? And it's sort of the idea in there is who had the idea. Sort of labor is easy and a commodity that can be replaced. The ideas are the big thing, and that is the person that should be sort of acknowledged. And that was kind of very shocking to me, seeing people that have actually done a lot of work not being formally acknowledged. But we have kind of pushed that to a limit in which just being your lab enables you to be a co-author on everything. And it's just, people feel entitled. I think this is one of the issues. Let me give you an example. There was this guy, a Nobel Prize chemist in Harvard. And the reason why I'm not going to name him is that I fortunately forgot his name. But he trained a lot of the top chemists around the US, at least. And I became aware of him because one of his students wrote in Angewandte Chemie an article saying about why women were not supposed to be chemists, that they were terrible. And that created a lot of commotion and stuff. And so I went and found out about his advisor and saw all of these other famous people that had been advised by him. And then I looked at how he operated. And so essentially the way that this guy operated is that he forced everybody to stay around the university past midnight. So it used to be that people would do their work, and then like at 6 they would go and you would give a talk. Then you would set up a problem for people, and then no one could solve it appropriately according to him. And then he would present the solution. And people were supposed to be doing this every day of the year. And you think about it, how can anyone involved have a family, right? How can you have a family if you are staying every day past midnight at work to be essentially humiliated by this guy that is showing you that whatever your solution to a problem was never as good to him? But this is the kind of thing that people still think that science is in some regards, right? That you are supposed to be in the lab all the time, right? From early morning to late in the evening. That there are people that organize their group meetings at 8 a.m. on a Sunday, right? It is essentially the advisors, the mentors, telling the students that they have control over every aspect of their life. And we let this happen because it's kind of each lab, it's their own world. And then you get surprised that some students feel angry with the way that things are. Because in the past, they would get a faculty position, right? This was their rite of passage. They were put through hell, but they would get a faculty position. But now they don't. Most of these students are never going to get a faculty position.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and talk about perspective a little bit. I used to be a high school teacher for several years, and I remember soon after I left, I was working for Nature, and I had learned that I worked in a low income community of color, and I'd learned that one of my students was in the hospital because of some violence, and I was talking to a potential. I was reporting then, and I was talking to a scientist for an article who gave himself just a little pity party about how hard everything was and how he wasn't sure if he was going to get tenure. And I understand that's very stressful, and everybody wants tenure very, very much. But I couldn't help but think, you are going to go home to your safe house and you know what you're eating tonight. So I just there's I think remembering that there is, yes, of course, people really want tenure and they want success, but there needs to be a broader picture as well. If you don't get tenure, you're still going to eat.
Yeah, exactly. And my wife is a painter, so scientific careers in terms of how good of a life you can have we are all very, very fortunate.
Yeah. So I think this does sort of get at this question of, getting back to something that came up, I think earlier, maybe in Jevan's talk, is this issue of incentives and why are their students pursuing scientific careers, and and how is the system selecting scientists, right? I mean, it's for better or worse, the people who do go to the labs where they work 80 hours a week and go to lab meeting at 8 a.m. maybe the ones who get jobs and push the system in whatever direction it's going. And I guess, is there, does that mean that this sort of incentive system is broken, that money and attention are too strong, and that the sort of curiosity and altruism that in theory, I think got many of us started in science is not being rewarded? And I guess, is there some way that could be fixed or nudged maybe?
The most intriguing practical example I've seen is to limit the number of graduate students that a PI can take. It's a much smaller ratio in other countries. And I think also realizing that the people applying to graduate school are very, very young, and they need to have a better sense of what the job prospects are. I've seen labor economists say that science is really messed up because whenever there's more funding, they just hire more cheap labor without any thought of how those people who will be spending so many hours will be incorporated into the workforce. And so I think I would like to see more discussion about staff scientists. I think we need to have so I should say, I'm just speaking as an individual here. Please, I don't make policy happen. But I do think an idea that needs to be explored is not having this many graduate students and postdocs who depend so solely on one powerful person. People have talked about having dual PIs, of having different career paths. I'm sure everybody here knows more about it than I do, so I'd like to hear more.
Luis, do you want to jump in first, or I can go before?
You go first, because I thought so much that I probably should try to stop hogging the.
No, yeah. Well, I'll say, just in terms of limitations, an idea that's been begged around for many years, and I've not seen a lot of progress, although you've now seen the requirements change a little bit on at least funding proposals, but that's just limiting publications too. I mean, just saying that, what if the dean said you get to only publish 5 papers a year? I mean, there's different fields and different publication rhythms that you'd have to take into account. But if people could only publish a couple of years, they would take a lot more time in those papers. They might, they should contribute more to the review system. As Luis said, I mean, there should be a ratio there. How much have you contributed to the review system and other aspects of science too? I think you could create these, and they have to come from the top. They have to come from those that are pushing the promotions, from the committees making hiring decisions. There are some, committees. We even did it in our own faculty. It sounds funny, but we made a declaration that we would read every paper in the application pool of candidates, so that we couldn't just look at metrics. And then we only require a certain amount of papers. And there's things that you can do at that level. You can do it at the funding level. The incentives, the way they're set up, does encourage people to not spend as much time in the things that we really need, like review and critique of the literature that's going out to the rest of science and to the public. I think there are things that can be done there to respond to incentives. There's an entire field of economics called mechanism design that's have spent a long time figuring out ways to align incentives with the objectives of the institution. And I don't think there's enough attention given to that. I mean, I have to say, as someone that's even read some of that literature, I could read more myself, but I think we can look to individuals that have thought about this a little bit more. And I think these incentives to always write papers too turn scientists that came in, like Stephen said, as idealistic like myself, thinking about just good questions and creative ways to solve societal challenges or things that we observe in nature or in our physical world, to them becoming people managers, really, and sort of like always writing that next grant. We spend so much time in grant writing, and I think that kills creativity. And you see administrations on universities, the ratio of administrators to scientists and teachers is just, it's unbalanced now. And I think that there's reasons that there's things that we could dig in there where we spend so much time, I mean, we spend so much of our resources on top-heavy administrations, administrative activity that, I mean, we could rethink that. I know it's not simple, it's complex, but I think, when good, smart scientists are spending 60-70% of their time writing grants, maybe we should rethink the whole granting system too. And really, there's no perfect solution, but let's at least rethink it, darn it. Because we're wasting our creativity and our time, just trying to check boxes and figuring out formatting and figuring out, all these other things and budgets, instead of just thinking and talking with students and talking through problems and spending more time on the things that do lead to innovation. So anyway, I think there are things, I guess that's kind of a mishmash of an answer, Stephen, but I think we should be thinking about those incentives, and we should be thinking about them from the top down, or so top and bottom up. So both from students that are coming in with that idealism that we want and that energy, but also saying, come on, people running science and running hiring committees and deans and stuff, like it has to change there a lot of times to make those things happen. So anyway, though, that's my mishmash answer.
I think you both raised a lot of really, really important points. And I want to emphasize this again. It's sort of, when we think about wisdom of the crowd and kind of pulling information together, we think that this works well. It's sort of, you have independent pieces of information that have about the same weight, right? But that's not the way that the system is moving towards. We have people that have a much greater weight, right? So if you publish 300 papers a year and you self-cite, and 30% of those citations are to your own papers are getting extremely well cited. They are becoming hot. And you have people like Eric Lander that used to, I'm sure, game the system to submit his papers at the right time. So they would be published in January. So they would become the hot paper for the year. And he kind of, every year, he had one of the top hot papers of the year. And if you have enough power and enough things, you can actually say when you are submitting a paper that you know is guaranteed to be published in Nature of Science. So I think it all comes down, like in many things, to power and to disproportionate power, and how people become attached to their own ideas and defending their own ideas. And I think this has a negative impact. And one thing that would be easy to do, actually it would not, but you could imagine that someone could only get grants on a given area for like 10 years, and then they would have to change, right? You'd have to change areas. And then, you would start a little bit from the beginning again, being a newcomer to a field or something. But the point is that you'd stop being so invested in defending that paper that you wrote 5 years ago, on which your entire reputation is now kind of invested. And it's, I like it. It's like a transfer of power. It's like, you can only be president 4 years, 8 years. You can only be in the field. Move on. Let some fresh ideas move in, and then you'd be less. Yeah, you're right. Attached to. There are things that we could do that would kind of break this accumulated power, right? I mean, this is about the Matthews effect. It's about accumulated power. This cumulative growth is multiplicative, meaning that the scale becomes very, very different, right? I mean, it's like, that was just NIH funding from 2010. There was 2 orders of magnitude between the most funded and the typical funded, right? 2 orders of magnitude. I mean, this is not, we are all on the same scale. So, yeah.
Right, and then yeah, exactly. And then not enough funding to pay graduate students or postdocs, and NIH are still making, a measly salary after 12 years of investment. And yeah, that 2 orders of magnitude is just disturbing, to say the least.
And the issues around money are really compelling, right? I mean, I'm remembering back in 2008 when there was the big stimulus, after the economic crisis, and all the conversations at my university were about, wow, look at this huge pot of money that's coming in. How are we going to get it, for our research? And the fact that like science would be involved or something along the way was kind of like a detail that was somehow. So it's interesting, right? I mean, we talk about kind of this idea of return on investment, economic models for science, but at the same time, there's something injecting a lot of money into something like this. It creates its own problems, and it's unclear how exactly you can kind of push back against something like that.
I'll give one example, and I'm not saying it's a perfectly thought out, but at least it's provocative enough to start conversations when it comes to actually funding. Is some of these lottery models that have they're starting to get a little more traction in conversations at meetings and conferences. There's certainly weaknesses with these lottery models, but there's certainly some we should experiment with a little bit. Maybe you have a 50% pool, like you get a pool of applicants. When you're on panels, a lot of times you kind of identify the ones that are sort of straightforward winner. I mean, great ideas, they should be funded. You sort of pull them over, maybe they're in the 10%, 25%. And then the others, you just say, okay, this group has sort of reached the bar, this 25% at the bottom, they don't reach the bar because they were applying to the wrong program or something. And then, so you got this other random assignment, and then there would be maybe less investment. People would waste less time into the grant process. They would put enough into it to get their ideas out, but these would be minimal asks and they'd spend more time on it. I mean, that's just one example of ways in which maybe there would be less emphasis. But I mean, there's a bunch of ideas coming out now, and I think right now we can set the standard or at least set the pathway for science over the next many decades around funding incentives. And that's, again, hopefully those in the crowd, all the students and future thinkers in this area, you kind of get to set that path. That's part of what the science of science can do, is you're looking at the system as a whole and thinking about these things that we've talked about this morning to kind of set that pathway. So that's why it's an important job. You got to do it. You got to take it serious.
May I jump in? I'm not on the panel, but I do think.
Yeah. And we should. If someone has a question, please feel free to.
Yes, for sure. Absolutely. Interrupt at any time.
Javin's idea really sort of echoed me, because I do look at all those models about the randomization of the fundings. The thing that I was thinking about is you don't get an experimental system to test the effectiveness of various funding model. I was thinking maybe we can start from students. So every students in every university somehow have to write small grant to get monies. And I was thinking maybe start from there and get some data, and maybe that would collect. So, and each grant size is really small. So the trouble of you making experiments on a larger system would be less troublesome in that sense. Maybe we could sort of tracking those research projects outcome from small students. And then
I think it's a great idea to be looking for these natural experiments, these pseudo randomized controls. And I think
you can actually make a randomized control.
Yeah, I mean, you can make it randomized. That would be the goal. That would be the golden ticket for sure. But I think there might be some opportunities, like, for example, this NFGFRP or some of these graduate fellowships that are offered through the NSF or other organizations. They've increased and changed some of those policies. And, I've been meaning to look into, I haven't, but there might be some, recent changes in policy would allow for some of these tests. And also, I know that there are some countries playing around with the idea of lotteries. And there's even been some philanthropic organizations that give money that have actually gone to some lotteries. So there might be some opportunity there. I haven't looked into it, but I think if others wanted to dig deeper, there might be some opportunity to look further into that. And I know some people that are working on it, so I could ask them if they know more than I do about it.
Okay, yeah, and so I do want to, if anyone else has a question, feel free to chime in. One other thing I did want to kind of get back to, because I think it was an important topic that we sort of got to earlier, was assuming scientific enterprise aside, this question of communicating with the rest of the world. And this is something that Daniel and I were kind of chatting back and forth about, is how do you, I guess, how do we kind of engage critically with each other, but at the same time kind of preserve the reputation of the field in the public, right? So I guess that this idea, problem, and maybe it's the idea came up about, well, if we criticize ourselves, is that going to be spun against us, or are there sort of effective ways to kind of work with the public, but be a good critical scientist at the same time?
I think one of the things that I believe is important, and this is my personal belief, is that there is the idea that science has to protect itself, right? Has to protect its own reputation. So we don't want to have kind of washing the dirty laundry in public or something like that, which is this idea that we are treating the public as children, right? That cannot handle the reality. But what end up is that you end up with a system that kind of that protects bad behavior, right? And you can think about police officers, right? It's sort of, even if you assume that most of them are good people, there are some that are very corrupt, but the entire system protects the corrupt ones so the reputation doesn't get damaged. We have that with surgeons and doctors, right? That the reason why we have sort of malpractice is that because it's known that medical societies do not kind of punish their own members that behave in an appropriate way. And so there is this belief that by suppressing what the problems, we make it look like everything is fine, as if people were stupid and didn't realize that there are bad things going on. And so, I think that if you treat the public like children, then you cannot expect them to behave like adults. If you say, oh yeah, usually in science, everybody agrees on something, instead of saying science goes through these big periods of fights until something kind of consensus emerges, right? If all agree, but some people are saying that climate change is not a problem, or that vaccines don't work, I mean, they don't know for sure. Instead of saying, no, that's not the way that it works, right? Consensus doesn't mean everybody. And it's Fauci was made into some kind of saint, right? But I think this conversation that he had with Rand Paul about why people should continue to wear masks for a while was terrible. I mean, from my view, the reason why vaccinated people should continue to use masks was that if you have unvaccinated and vaccinated, and you cannot figure out if someone is vaccinated or not, the best social solution is for everybody to wear masks, right? So you don't have to question someone. But he didn't make it about that. He didn't make it about, we want to avoid social conflict. So we ask people that are vaccinated to continue to wear masks. There would have been even other benefits, but he made it about something else. And it's like, people see that what you are saying makes no sense, right? But they don't want to treat the public like adults. And so to me, it's very important that we are honest about what's going on, about the doubts in the system, right? And that we try to always provide some historical background, right? With climate change, for a time, the worry was the snowball Earth, right? That's what was in a lot of people, was that, we would have an ice age coming. And people were not thinking about the accumulation of CO2, at least not very many. So there was a time of struggle and changing. But, we don't talk about that. We don't teach in science in high school. We teach kids about facts. We don't teach them about the process. Well, the process is much more interesting and it has much better lessons.
Yeah, if you're a Cub science reporter, it used to be that your very first assignment would be what's called a one-paper story. And then this would be what they would give scientists science reporters who didn't have a lot of experience. And it would be some paper was coming out, you would interview the author of that paper, you would interview one person who wasn't involved in that paper, boom, bam, boom, you've got a story. It's really, and the problem with this kind of reporting, and it is dissipating people, is that it puts the paper on a pedestal, which means that the paper has more power than it should to be, oh, this is the conclusion, this is what we think. And it destroys the distinction between how evidence accumulates in different ways, because the one paper story would treat an incredibly rigorous study that had been 10 years in the making as essentially equivalent to, some little catchy thing. So I agree that there needs to be a greater understanding of the process. And I also think that, the most powerful scientists are sorry, this isn't, I'm not saying it the way I want to. I think that science should portray itself as self-critical, and that should be rewarded. I mean, I think Retraction Watch has a nice feature that says doing the right thing, that sort of normalizes making mistakes. I don't think it's as far along as it should be, but I think that there needs to be a lot more effort made to show that, to encourage science to be more self-correcting and to show that process of self-correction.
Yeah, I could not agree more with both Maya and Luis on this, that if we don't show our dirty laundry, we're not going to engender trust in the public. I'm not saying we have to show everything, but I've been criticized many times myself for when like doing some of this, calling bullshit. I do it a lot on science too. I always try to start with saying, despite some of these challenges, that there are things that still work well in science. I try to end the lectures that way too. But I think it's important for the public when we ask them to source. We tell this to the public a lot, especially during this misinformation phase that we're going through. Not that we haven't had misinformation, but we've had it for a long time, but certainly now we say, okay, go check your source. Well, a lot of the sourcing leads you down to primary literature, leads you down to scientific articles. And if we don't warn them of things like predatory publishers, that not all science is equal, and that sort of, there's this infection of that, there are things that we learn that are wrong later on, that there are clashes, that there are disagreements, that there are things that sometimes science gets wrong, that that when someone sees a health article about wine helping them or not helping their sleep and their longevity or whatever it is, that it's part of a kind of a meta conversation that's going on, and that gets sorted out, that it's not as clean as everyone wants it to be. And it's not that the TV shows and the movies that you see about science, it doesn't always work that cleanly, or how you sometimes read it in textbooks or in schools that teach about science. Then I think that it's messy, and that there are challenges that we're going through. But then that, I think, engenders stress. I think that we treat the public as not being very smart about this, and they are adults, and they are smart. If you treat them like adults, I think that's the outcome is better. I mean, you might get some distrust early on, and people might then point to, like they are a lot of times in these conspiracy circles, pointing to the reproducibility crisis as an example of why you can't trust scientists. That's going to happen no matter what, whether you point it out or whether someone else points it out and finds it. And I think I think we need to be we should go forward and be able to speak honestly about even the things that aren't going well in science. So anyway, I just agree very much with both those, and it's a philosophy I definitely subscribe to.
Okay, so looks like there's a question from Rodri.
Yeah, I just was interested to hear maybe people's thoughts. I completely agree that like airing the dirty laundry of science is a really important thing to do. I come from a field, science and technology studies, and I'm at Edinburgh, and we got kind of heavily criticized and embroiled in a science war in what were called the science wars in the 1990s. And we were, people call us kind of enemies of science, essentially. And what we always, and you know, I work with lots of these people, they always saw themselves as just trying to be honest and explaining scientific practice, but it was in a way that lots of people didn't like. But it does seem that the whole attitude towards this has changed, and that people are now being able to kind of speak more openly about science in a way that isn't engendering kind of just a instant you're crazy anti-scientists. So I don't know whatever has happened with the Science for Science crowd. It seems that maybe the public is at a time, or at least science is at a time where it's ready to have the kind of difficult conversations, which it wasn't apparently 20 years ago.
I think one of the points also is really to communicate to the public how hard scientific advances are. And so I'm a physicist by training, and my favorite thing of all of physics are the laws of thermodynamics. And I'll tell you why. Because they tell us about limits, right? The first one tells us that you cannot make energy out of anything, right? It's sort of energy gets conserved. And the other one is that most transformations transform high quality energy into low quality energy. And these things enable you to say, if you come to me with a proposal for a perpetual motion machine, that it's not going to work, right? I don't need to go through all the math and stuff. It's just like these limits tell you that those things don't work. And we don't do enough of finding the limits of something that we are doing, right? So we talk about CRISPR as the ability to rewrite genomes. And my comparison is to say, and now I'm going to ask a monkey to rewrite Shakespeare. It's like we do not know and understand genomes. So the idea that you would rewrite them is kind of absurd. We are not at that stage yet, right? Or machine learning, the idea that out of nothing you can create something, information in there. There was this famous paper, I mean, at least famous in my mind because it got me so mad, from Google, in which they say they could take a lower resolution image and create a higher resolution version of it. Okay. Essentially what they were using was machine learning to figure out, usually this pixel corresponds to this other set of pixels in a higher resolution image, and then you create it. And they were presenting it as kind of finding out what actually had been in the lower resolution, instead of kind of making a guess of what one of the zillion of images that would have been low resolved in that version. You know, and it's kind of, people believe this stuff, right? All the CSI series in which enhance that image, right? Okay, now you can see the in the reflection on the screw of the license plate, you can actually see the murder with the knife killing the victim, right? And it's like, people don't understand the limits or how hard things are, right? That Biden would have said, we are going to cure cancer. No, you aren't. The biggest advances in cancer have been about early detection and taking it out of you early enough. Or so we are nowhere close to curing cancer, because cancer is such a complex, diverse disease. Or when the Broad Institute got $650 million from these donors to solve schizophrenia in 5 years. This was, I think, like 5 years ago, right? We have no clue what schizophrenia is. We are going to cure it in 5 years by sequencing shit? No, we aren't. But the public doesn't understand the limits of things because we haven't told them that there are limits to things. And so they believe anything, because it's like, you know, it's, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important also to remember that the public is a false single noun.
Mm-hmm.
there are a lot of publics, a lot of different levels of sophistication, and you know, and it sometimes frustrates me when I hear people talk about scientific communication as if it's one thing, because the question needs to be about, you know, what do you want to know about others? What did they want to know? I mean, it really needs to be it's something to think about a lot of different approaches rather than one overarching approach. I think we've talked about how hard it is to have a life in science, but I think one of the most important things is to be able to talk about your job with your neighbor and your PTA president. I mean, and also just to feel like people think that I feel like there's this sense of communicating with the public is like somebody like broadcasting from on high. And I've talked to high school teachers. I've talked to people who say, you know, why didn't you show, you know, we have textbooks on evolution that we can't teach from, but nobody was showing up to help us. And I think that that instead of talking about science communication as sort of this broad thing, it needs to be, you know, showing up at a school meeting, showing up or just talking to your neighbors, figuring out where scientists' voice can matter. Because I've heard people say, well, where are the scientists? You know, I need somebody, I can't get somebody to show up at my policy meeting. I think that thinking about varied ways to interact is important.
Yeah, so I'm curious, I guess, in terms of kind of the press, you know, scientific press, have there been any sort of evolutions in a direction which you think, and maybe it's more from Monia, but that have been more effective? I mean, are there sort of new strategies for communication that seem to work?
I mean, I think when there is a sense that of outrage that scientists have when journalists are not cheerleaders, and I think that is getting better. And I think a lot of science reporters go into science reporting because they are real. I mean, you know, science is exciting. It's fascinating. But I think that it is more and more expected that when I think the one paper story is fading. It's not, our interns don't do that in the way that they used to. Now it is expected when you're reporting that you are going to say, well, what have other papers in the field say? You're expected to look at the broader literature. It means that it takes a lot more time. It means that those stories are more complex, but that is that's definitely something that I'm saying. I mean, we also try to read every article to see what sentences might be pulled out and taken out of context and fix those, which does mean some clunkier sentences. But I think there is a greater sense of sophistication. I think there's also more linking to try to, so that people can trace things back to the primary literature, to original sources, and also more interaction between reporters and readers on Twitter.
All right, so any, oh, okay, here's a question from Ali.
Thanks for the interesting discussion. I would like to ask about the issue of pace in terms of time. Like while doing science, normally in terms of peer review or in terms of like the way things go on in science, we have the luxury of time at our disposal in most cases. Of course, in my age, like early career researchers have less of it, unfortunately. But I would like to ask, I would like to highlight the example of COVID that what happened was we needed a much higher pace in terms of communicating results or communicating guidelines or policies to the public. This kind of, in my opinion, brought something out of science that was really interesting. I don't have a word for them, but I call them hybrid scientists, like those who are scientists, but closer to the policymakers. So they wear different hats, or they have the power or the possibilities to touch, to communicate to the media or to the, for example, like, I don't know, whoever needs to hear that. So these people, and some of them, I would say, misuse this space, like, and they might have, I'm not sure, because I was just gathering literature. I have not been able to study it. I would be happy to hear if there are studies on causing public distrust in science due to exactly this communication in the wrong way, because you are trying to keep up with the pace. And unfortunately, you are communicating multiple contradicting things that scientists are used to it, like falsifying your own ideas from yesterday is kind of part of the job for us. But communicating these two contradicting things might cause a different view to kind of like they think, yeah, maybe they don't know what they are doing. Maybe should I wear a mask? Like my illiterate parents were asking, should I wear a mask or not? Do they know what they are talking about? And what would, this, and I was thinking has to do with the pace. This has to do with the timeliness of communication. What do you think about that? I hope it was clear.
Well, I'll make just a couple quick comments on that. I do think the pandemic has created a unique environment to study communication across science, from society into science and vice versa. And there has been this need to speed up because the public has had a very strong appetite for results in science. And if scientists aren't going to provide it, they're going to look somewhere else on the internet. And there are plenty of armchair scientists, some of them effective at communicating and critiquing work that's coming out. In fact, there are some nice examples of papers that went on the preprint archives, bioarchive in particular, a little early and had some mistakes. Nothing, I don't think, nefarious, and some of them were taken down fast enough, but they were still spreading. And then there are, of course, the armchair scientists that are kind of a detriment to the process because they're pushing certain kinds of narratives. Actually, something we're tracking on a project right now, looking at vaccine misinformation and what's pushing these things, everything from, these shell kind of local media outlets that really aren't local media outlets, but pretend to be, and pushing certain kinds of misinformation when it comes to health information, and then pushed by scientists or doctors. And people look at that with, with credibility. But even aside from some of these more sort of straight on disinformation campaigns around health information, there is mixed messages coming from the very top. And that makes it difficult for your parent or for anyone's reasonable neighbor or friend that just wants to have an answer, and they're getting mixed messages even from the top, and that's challenging. And some of it's explainable for the information at the time is what they knew or whatever, and you can explain these kinds of things. But it's this cranking up of time. I mean, if we had the luxury of time in this pandemic, we had 10 years to sort out the origins of the virus, the best kinds of treatments, the best kinds of public policy, we would have less errors coming out. But because it's been, cranked up to a speed that scientists into a lane that's not as comfortable with, there are going to be more errors. And then there needs to be more investment on trying to figure out how to communicate that to the public. So as there's almost this ratio that as we increase the speed in which results are coming out, or at least the appetite for those results, so people, things are just moving a little faster in the process. There needs to be, a concomitant kind of increase in the communication investment around what's coming out. And this goes back to actually Luis's early comment about the importance of peer review. It's one of the when preprints first came out, there was all this talk about post peer review being sort of the answer to some of the problems that we had, some of the issues around peer review. And the problem was that no one had the time or the incentives or wanted to really speak their mind in peer review or post review. And PLOS tried some of these things, and I admire them for trying, and it didn't quite reach what we'd wanted to. But for the first time, at least in my view of this, it's the first time that I've seen real post peer review happening at a scale where the scientists, science was seeing it, but also the public around these preprint archives. And so I think that speed up was sort of compensated with some very nice post peer review and takedowns early of mistakes that were happening. So I think this issue of time, this things being speed up and the luxury of time, I would say lack of luxury even that we've had during the pandemic is an important element in all this in this conversation about communicating science to the public. So anyway, this is more of a commentary than sort of a direct response, but I think it's an important point.
I would like to add two things about what the pandemic also showed. And one of them was someone reminded me that they asked me how long this COVID thing was going to be around. And I said several years, because I thought it's going, the fastest vaccine developed before was 4 years, right? And kind of, it works so amazingly well, which actually demonstrates the power of doing science the right way, right? Because of the crisis, people were forced to collaborate and share results. We went into these clinical trials in parallel instead of waiting. There were lots of resources to get people enrolled. So, we could do something that from the past we knew how to do in a kind of more efficient and streamlined way. And it was an incredible success that we had so many highly effective vaccines in so fast. And that was a case in which the people with the knowledge were put to work on the problem, right? And instead of them kind of competing, they were put to work collaboratively. I think that was not so exciting was the publishing of papers on COVID, in which everybody and their brother kind of decided that they were moving to COVID and published papers, and some of them were complete crap. And it's one of those things in which actually you should have said the right thing to do is to actually review the work that is being posted by people that are qualified, right? Having more eyes looking at it. And again, it's a case in which the incentives could be improved, right? Wouldn't it be nice to have a way to reward people for good reviews of preprints, right? It's kind of some way to kind of highlight that someone did a careful review of a preprint. And there were some very nice, careful reviews of preprints in Twitter on these threads that were like 50 messages and stuff like that. And I was just thinking, Twitter is completely horrible to put this. Can't we put it somewhere else and still acknowledge it or something? But it's like, there is lots of roles that we can do. And some people don't know about COVID or epidemiologic modeling, but they know about statistics. Other people know about pre-processing data. And it's kind of, we could have contributed to the review of these papers and kind of having an even faster and more effective way. And again, it would be something in which it would be interesting for me, for us to develop the right incentives and systems. Just like PLOS One was sort of a way to say we are going to have these papers that we don't say about how exciting they are. They just need to be enough of an advance, and we are going to review them technically, or eLife kind of having editors make more of the decision and kind of bringing consensus among the reviewers. There are ways in which I think we could reward, and especially for young scientists, right? Reward reviews of preprints. It's a great skill to read a paper critically and figure out what's going on. And you could write about it, and you could have a system in which you could acknowledge that. And it would be providing a societal service because so many preprints never get reviewed, and even peer review in journals, it's 2 reports or 3 or 4. And on the preprint, you could potentially have 10, 20, 30 that would be evaluating something. So I think there are great opportunities for these things. and also to show how science can address and tackle really, really big, important problems.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks. Any other questions? I know we're running a little bit over time, so I want to give everyone a chance for lunch or whatever meal you eat at this time of day. And then I guess also just we have to take our break before we start the one-on-one meetings. So I guess if there are no more burning questions, just want to make sure to thank the panelists again for really a very inspiring, motivating conversation. And I think this conversation will probably continue in a number of smaller conversations throughout the day. So, so I'm excited to see where that goes.
Thank you. Good to see you all.
Yes, thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for the great comments in the comment box too. Thanks, great links and great questions, and looking forward to talking to others.
So quick announcement. So for the mentors, just join the same Zoom link in like half an hour, and there will be like rooms for each of you, and then students will just drop in this. Everything is self-arranged. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, everyone. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.